The crying pierced through the airplane cabin like a siren, each cry sharper than the last. Diane clutched her 6-month-old daughter, feeling the heat of 100 hostile stares burning into her back. Her light pink sweater was now stained with spit-up and dampened with her own anxious sweat. She rocked her daughter with trembling arms, whispering broken apologies that dissolved into the recycled air of economy class. "Please, Angel, please," she breathed, but her 6-month-old daughter only screamed louder, as if sensing her mother's desperation and reflecting it back tenfold. At 24, Diane looked like she'd lived twice that many years. Dark crescents shadowed her eyes, and her once bright smile had faded under the weight of single motherhood and crushing poverty. Her ex had vanished the moment she'd shown him the positive pregnancy test, leaving her with nothing but an eviction notice and a growing belly. Every morning was a calculation. Diapers or dinner, heat or formula, survival or dignity. She'd scraped together every last dollar for this flight to Denver, traveling to a job interview that represented her final lifeline. One chance. One shot at stability. And now her baby was destroying it, second by screaming second. The flight attendant materialized beside her, her smile as thin as paper. "Ma'am, you need to quiet your baby. Other passengers have complained." "I'm trying," Diane whispered, her voice fracturing. "She won't stop, I don't know what." "Several passengers are recording this," the attendant interrupted, her tone clipped. "Perhaps you should consider the lavatory until she settles." Shame flooded through Diane's chest, hot and suffocating. She could see phones pointed in her direction, capturing her humiliation for viral entertainment. The young mother who ruined everyone's flight. She clutched her screaming daughter tighter, wishing she could disappear. "Maybe think twice before dragging a baby onto a plane," a businessman across the aisle muttered, just loud enough. Tears blurred Diane's vision. She rose on unsteady legs, ready to flee to the tiny bathroom, when a presence shifted beside her. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. "Allow me." The voice was low, measured, and utterly commanding. Diane looked up and forgot how to breathe. Before we continue, I've noticed that many of you enjoy watching my videos but haven't subscribed yet. Please help support and grow this channel by liking the video, dropping a comment, and subscribing if you enjoy the stories. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Now, let's get back to the story. The man towering over her didn't belong in economy. Long dark hair fell past his shoulders in waves that caught the cabin light like silk. His suit was midnight black, tailored to perfection, and radiated a wealth that made the first-class section look shabby. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart, dark, intense, and touched with the faintest hint of crimson, like embers barely banked beneath ash. Those eyes locked onto hers with a focus that felt predatory, absolute. An alpha recognizing prey. What?" Diane stammered. "Your daughter," he said, and somehow his voice cut through the baby's cries without rising in volume. "May I?" Every instinct screamed danger. Men this powerful, this beautiful, didn't help struggling single mothers out of kindness. They collected. They consumed. They owned. But her baby was screaming, passengers were filming, and she was drowning. "Okay," she whispered, barely audible. The man reached down with hands that looked strong enough to break bone, yet moved with supernatural gentleness. The moment he lifted Diane's daughter against his chest, the impossible happened. Silence. The baby's screams cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. Her tiny fists unclenched, her red face softened, and she nestled into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket like she'd found home. The man's large hand moved in slow circles across her back, and he hummed something wordless and ancient that seemed to vibrate through the cabin itself. Around them, the hostility evaporated. Passengers who'd been glaring moments before now watched with fascination. The flight attendant paused mid-aisle, her irritation replaced by something almost like reverence. Diane stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "How did you?" She needed certainty. The man said simply, his crimson-touched eyes never leaving the baby's face. Babies sense chaos. "I merely provided order." There was something in the way he said it, in the absolute authority radiating from him, that made the hair on Diane's neck rise. This wasn't a man who'd babysat his nieces. This was something else entirely. "What's her name?" he asked, still holding her daughter with unnerving ease. "Emma," Diane managed. "And I'm Diane. I don't know how to thank you." "Jacob," he replied, and when his gaze shifted to her, she felt pinned like a butterfly under glass. "And gratitude isn't necessary." I was compelled. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning she couldn't decipher. "You're not sitting in economy," she said, noting the immaculate cut of his suit, the platinum watch glinting at his wrist. Everything about him screamed power, wealth, and something darker, something that made her pulse quicken with equal parts fear and fascination. "No," Jacob agreed, a hint of amusement touching his severe features. "I'm not." He didn't elaborate, and Diane found she couldn't press. Not when he was holding her baby like a treasure, not when passengers were finally settling back into their seats, not when exhaustion was crashing over her like a wave she could no longer fight. For the first time in months, Emma slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling against Jacob's shoulder. The man made no move to return her, and Diane didn't ask him to. She was too mesmerized by the sight, her struggling, ordinary life pressed against his extraordinary presence, and somehow, impossibly, finding peace there. "You should rest," Jacob said, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks." "I can't just—" Diane started, but her protest died as her body betrayed her. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was draining away, leaving only bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "Your daughter is safe," Jacob said, and it wasn't a reassurance, it was a declaration, a fact of the universe. Rest. Against every learned instinct, every warning her life had taught her about powerful men and their motives, Diane felt her defenses crumbling. The warmth radiating from Jacob's body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the miracle of Emma's silence, it created a sanctuary she hadn't known she was starving for. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy. The cabin lights softened, and as the airplane carried them through the darkness, Diane's head drifted sideways, coming to rest against Jacob's shoulder. The last thing she registered before sleep claimed her was the shift in his posture, protective, possessive, and the whisper of his voice, too quiet for anyone else to hear.
"Mean it."
What Diane didn't know as she slept was that Jacob Thorne hadn't been in economy by chance. He'd been watching her struggle for the past hour, drawn by something he couldn't name and refused to ignore. What she also didn't know was that Jacob wasn't just wealthy or powerful. He was the alpha, leader of the most influential network in North America, a man whose word could topple corporations and reshape lives with a single phone call. And this chance encounter, born from desperation and answered by absolute power, was about to transform both their worlds in ways neither could escape. Diane woke to the gentle chime of the seatbelt sign, her mind surfacing slowly from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. Warmth surrounded her, and for one blissful moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so safe. Then reality crashed back. She was still leaning against Jacob's shoulder. Emma was still sleeping peacefully in his arms, and his free hand had somehow found its way to rest against Diane's hair, protective and possessive in a way that should have terrified her. "Oh God," Diane breathed, jerking upright. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." But when she met Jacob's eyes, those impossible eyes with their hint of crimson, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not annoyance, not pity, hunger. And beneath it, something far more dangerous, recognition, as if he'd been waiting his entire life for her to fall asleep on his shoulder, as if she'd somehow completed a picture he'd been assembling in the dark. "Don't apologize," Jacob said softly, his voice wrapping around her like silk and steel. "You needed rest. I needed." He trailed off, but his eyes finished the sentence, and what Diane saw there made her heart hammer against her ribs. Whatever had just begun between them on this flight, she realized with creeping certainty, wasn't kindness. It was claiming, and she had no idea whether she'd just been saved or captured. Diane couldn't look away from him. Jacob held Emma with a competence that defied explanation, his large hands cradling her daughter's fragile weight as if he'd been born to protect small, precious things. The contrast was dizzying. The brutal expense of his midnight suit against Emma's worn onesie, the sharp angles of his jaw softened by the way he gazed down at the sleeping infant, the raw power emanating from him like heat from a furnace, tempered only by the impossible gentleness in his touch. She should have been afraid. Every survival instinct she'd honed through years of disappointment and betrayal screamed that men like him didn't simply help. They calculated. They maneuvered. They took. But Emma slept on, her tiny fingers curled against his chest, and the chaos that had defined Diane's existence for months had simply stopped. "You're trembling," Jacob observed, his voice that low rumble that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly through her bones. "When did you last sleep? Truly sleep?" Diane tried to answer, but her throat closed around the words. Months. It had been months since she'd felt anything but terror and exhaustion, since she'd allowed herself to close her eyes without calculating which bill would go unpaid, which meal she'd skip, which part of her dignity she'd sacrifice next. "Rest," Jacob said, and it wasn't a suggestion. The crimson flecks in his dark eyes seemed to glow brighter, and the air around them grew heavy, insulated, as if he'd drawn an invisible boundary between their small corner of the cabin and the rest of the world. "I have her. You're safe." Safe. The word was foreign, a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Diane's exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was existential, a weariness that had seeped into her marrow and hollowed her out from the inside. The adrenaline that had carried her through the humiliation, through the hostile stares and whispered judgments, was evaporating, leaving nothing but the truth of how close to breaking she really was. She felt herself swaying, her body making the decision her mind was too stubborn to accept. Jacob shifted slightly, his shoulder angling toward her in silent invitation, and before Diane could stop herself, she was leaning into him. The moment her head touched his shoulder, something fundamental shifted. Warmth enveloped her, solid and absolute, and the scent of him, dark spice and something wilder, almost primal, wrapped around her senses like a drug. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Diane stopped fighting. Sleep claimed her in seconds, dragging her down into darkness, so complete and peaceful it felt like drowning in silk. Jacob felt the exact moment she surrendered. The tension in her small frame melted away, her breathing deepened, and her weight settled against him with a trust she didn't even know she was giving. His jaw tightened. Mine, every instinct howled. Mine to protect. Mine to keep. He'd sensed her the moment he'd boarded, drawn by something he couldn't name and refused to question. The alpha in him had catalogued everything in seconds, her exhaustion, her desperation, the fierce maternal fire burning beneath her poverty and shame. She was breaking, and the sight had carved something raw and painful into his chest. The red in his eyes deepened, a manifestation of the absolute focus he reserved for matters of conquest and protection. Around them, the cabin seemed to dim, responding to the silent command of his presence. Passengers who'd been restless settled into unnatural calm. The flight attendant who approached glanced at him once, then redirected without a word, as if an invisible hand had guided her away. Jacob created order through sheer force of will, bending his environment to his needs. And right now, his only need was ensuring that this exhausted, beautiful woman and her child remained undisturbed in the cocoon of safety he'd wrapped around them. He looked down at Diane's sleeping face, then at the infant in his arms, and felt something dangerous take root in his chest. He'd built an empire on ruthless calculation, had learned to weaponize his alpha status until fear and respect were indistinguishable. But this fragile, struggling single mother had demolished his control with nothing but her desperate love for her child. She had no idea what she'd awakened in him. No idea that the moment she'd accepted his help, she'd sealed both their fates. Jacob's hand moved to rest gently against her hair, possessive and protective, as the plane carried them through the night toward a future neither of them could escape. Diane surfaced from sleep slowly, awareness returning in fragments. Warmth. Security. The steady rise and fall of breathing that wasn't her own. For one perfect moment, she existed in that liminal space between dreams and waking, where nothing hurt and everything felt possible. Then her eyes opened, and terror flooded in. She was wrapped in Jacob's arm, held against his body with an intimacy that should have been impossible between strangers. His hand rested at the curve of her waist, fingers splayed possessively across her hip. Emma still slept peacefully in his other arm, and the three of them formed a tableau that looked like a family, like something Diane had stopped believing could exist. She stiffened, and Jacob's eyes opened immediately, that crimson-touched gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Easy," he murmured, but he didn't release her. "You've been asleep for almost 3 hours." "I shouldn't have," Diane started, trying to pull away, but his arm tightened fractionally. Not forceful, but immovable. "Why not?" Jacob's voice was calm, curious, as if holding a stranger and her baby through a transatlantic flight was the most natural thing in the world. "When did you decide you weren't allowed to rest?" The question cracked something open inside her. Maybe it was the sleep, or the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth more than the sum of her failures. Maybe it was simply that she was too tired to maintain her walls anymore. 6 months ago, Diane heard herself say, "When Emma's father told me I'd trapped him and walked out. When I realized I was completely alone." The words spilled out, unstoppable now. "I work 3 jobs. I sleep 4 hours a night when I'm lucky. I'm going to Denver for a job interview that could change everything, but I used my rent money for this ticket, and I don't know what happens if I don't get it. I don't know how much longer I can." She stopped, horrified by her own confession. She just vomited her entire pathetic existence to a stranger who looked like he'd never struggled for anything in his life. But Jacob didn't look disgusted or pitying. He looked furious. "He abandoned you," Jacob said, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Abandoned both of you. It doesn't matter anymore," Diane whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. "It matters." Jacob's free hand moved to cup her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "You matter. What you've survived matters. And any man who could walk away from this," his eyes dropped to Emma, then back to Diane, "is a fool who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air." The conviction in his voice made her want to believe him, made her want to lean into this impossible moment and pretend that powerful, beautiful men actually cared about broken single mothers with nothing to offer. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Diane asked, and hated how her voice cracked on the question. Jacob's expression shifted into something she couldn't read, something that looked almost like pain. "Because I can't seem to stop," he said simply. "Because the moment you looked at me, exhausted and terrified and still trying to protect your daughter, The cabin intercom chimed, interrupting whatever confession had been forming on his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen, We've begun our descent into Denver International Airport. The flight attendant materialized beside them, and Diane noticed how her eyes widened slightly when she saw Jacob. The woman's professional smile faltered, replaced by something that looked like recognition and deference. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She glanced at Diane, then back to Jacob, and dipped her head in what could only be described as a bow. "The Alpha's preferred car is waiting at the private terminal. Will you be requiring the standard security detail?" The words hung in the air like poison. The Alpha. Diane's blood turned to ice. She looked at Jacob, at Mr. Thorne, and saw the truth written in the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes flared with that crimson glow, brighter now, almost predatory. "That won't be necessary," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral, but his arm remained locked around Diane's waist as she tried to pull away. The flight attendant nodded and retreated, but the damage was done. Diane's heart hammered against her ribs. The Alpha. She'd heard whispers, rumors of a man who controlled half the business deals in North America from the shadows, who could destroy companies with a word, who commanded loyalty and fear in equal measure. She'd fallen asleep in a predator's arms. The moment the plane touched down, Diane moved. She extracted herself from Jacob's hold with jerky, panicked movements, gathering Emma and her worn diaper bag with trembling hands. She didn't look at him. Couldn't look at him. If she did, she might see something that would make her want to stay, and staying would destroy her. "Diane." His voice cut through the cabin noise, commanding and desperate in equal measure. She ignored him, pushing past businessmen retrieving luggage from overhead bins, her only thought to reach the jet bridge, to disappear into the anonymous crowd of the terminal before whatever game he was playing could snap shut around her. But Jacob was faster. His hand caught her elbow in the tunnel between plane and terminal, his grip gentle but immovable, and suddenly she was pressed against the wall with Emma between them, Jacob's body blocking her escape and shielding them from the flow of deplaning passengers. "Please," he said, and the words sounded foreign in his mouth, like he rarely used it. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Diane's voice was barely controlled. "That you're the Alpha? That you were probably slumming an economy for entertainment? That helping the poor single mom was what? A power trip?" Jacob flinched as if she'd struck him. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, holding it between them like a peace offering. The card was black, heavy stock, with a silver crest embossed at the center, a wolf's head, crown sitting between its ears. Below it, simple silver text, Jacob Thorne. "Take it," he said. "When you're ready to hear the truth, call me." Diane stared at the card, at the symbol of everything he was and everything she could never be. Her fingers reached for it automatically, muscle memory of politeness overriding her fear. The moment her fingers touched the cardstock, a voice spoke from behind Jacob. "Alpha." The word was reverential, absolute. "Your car is waiting." Diane looked past Jacob to see three men in dark suits, their builds suggesting military training, their postures suggesting complete readiness for violence. The one who'd spoken stood at the front, his head slightly bowed, and everything about his body language screamed one message: "I exist to serve." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn. "I said I didn't require security, Marcus." "With respect, Alpha. Protocol demands," Marcus began, but Jacob cut him off with a look that made the larger man take a step back. The exchange lasted 3 seconds, but Diane saw everything she needed to see. The power, the control, the casual expectation of absolute obedience. This wasn't just wealth. This was dominion. "Is this what you do?" The words tore out of her before she could stop them. "Find desperate women and play savior? Make them dependent so you can what? Collect us? Add us to whatever empire you're building." "Diane," Jacob started, something raw flashing across his face. "I've heard the stories," she continued, her voice rising. Emma stirred in her arms, sensing her agitation. "Powerful men who see struggling single mothers as projects, as things to fix and own. Women who think they're being saved until they realize they've just traded one prison for another." "That's not what this is," Jacob said, and for the first time, his perfect control cracked. His eyes blazed with that crimson fire, and his voice dropped to something between a plea and a growl. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with power or control. It's a lie." Diane looked down at the business card in her hand, at the crown wolf staring up at her, and felt something break inside her chest. She'd let herself hope. For 3 hours, sleeping in his arms, she'd let herself believe that someone might actually want to help her without strings attached. She should have known better. Diane lifted her eyes to meet his and saw him see the moment she made her choice. She took the business card, held it up between them so he could watch, and tore it in half. Then in half again. The pieces fluttered to the terminal floor like black snow. "Stay away from us," she whispered. Then she ran, clutching Emma to her chest, pushing through the crowd toward baggage claim, toward the exit, toward her interview and her uncertain future. She chose the struggle she knew over the golden cage. She didn't. She chose poverty over becoming someone's possession. Behind her, she heard Marcus speak. "Alpha, should we?" "Let her go," Jacob said, his voice hollow. But even as Diane fled through the terminal, even as she told herself she'd made the right choice, she could feel his eyes on her back. Watching, waiting, hunting. The room smelled like mildew and broken promises. Diane sat on the edge of her cousin Miranda's sagging couch, Emma asleep in a portable crib borrowed from a neighbor, and stared at the water stains spreading across the ceiling like a map of her failures. Miranda had been kind enough to offer the couch for a week, but the judgment in her eyes had been clear. Another poor decision, another man who'd let her down, another burden she'd have to carry alone. Diane pulled her laptop from her bag, the screen cracked from when she dropped it 3 months ago, and reviewed her interview notes for the 10th time. Administrative assistant at a mid-sized accounting firm. $32,000 a year. Benefits after 6 months. It was barely enough to survive on, but it was steady. Safe. Hers. She wouldn't think about Jacob. Wouldn't remember the warmth of his arms or the way his eyes had looked when she'd torn up his card. Wouldn't wonder what he'd been about to say before she'd run. The television flickered in the corner, Miranda's background noise while she worked her night shift. Diane tried to ignore it until a name cut through her thoughts like a blade. Thorne Industries announced today a $50 million expansion into renewable energy infrastructure. The news anchor's voice was professionally enthusiastic. CEO Jacob Thorne, often called the alpha of American business, continues to reshape entire sectors with what industry insiders describe as an almost preternatural instinct for. Diane's hand found the remote and killed the sound, but the image remained. Jacob on screen, standing behind a podium, his long hair pulled back, his expression carved from stone. The crimson tint in his eyes was barely visible on camera, but she knew it was there. She'd seen it up close, had felt it focus on her like a physical touch. $50 million. He'd moved $50 million while she was calculating whether she could afford both bus fare and dinner. Her phone buzzed. An email notification from an address she didn't recognize. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but something made her open it instead. "Dear Ms. Whitmore, we are pleased to offer you the position of Executive Assistant to the CEO at Thornfield Consulting Group. Starting salary, $85,000 annually, full benefits, housing stipend included. Please respond within 24 hours to accept." Diane's blood ran cold. Thornfield. Thorn. It was too obvious to be coincidence, too perfectly timed to be anything but his doing. He'd found her email somehow, had probably known exactly which company she'd applied to, and was now trying to buy his way back into her life. She deleted the email with shaking hands and threw her phone across the room. Across the city, in a penthouse suite that overlooked Denver like a kingdom, Marcus stood before Jacob's desk and wished he were anywhere else. The alpha hadn't moved in 3 hours, hadn't eaten, hadn't even blinked as far as Marcus could tell. He simply sat in the darkness, staring at his hands as if they'd betrayed him. "We lost her trail at her cousin's apartment building in Capitol Hill," Marcus reported, his military training the only thing keeping his voice steady. "I can have surveillance in place within the hour. Full detail, round-the-clock monitoring."
No.
Jacob's voice was empty, hollow in a way Marcus had never heard.
No surveillance. No monitoring.
"Alpha, she could be in danger. The neighborhood isn't." I said no. Jacob finally looked up, and Marcus saw something in his eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. Not anger, anguish. I terrified her, Marcus. She looked at me like I was a monster, and she ran. If I send security, I prove her right. "Then what do you want me to do?" Marcus asked carefully. Jacob was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice cracked around the edges. "Find out everything about her interview tomorrow. The company, the position, the salary. Make sure they treat her fairly. Make sure she has what she needs. But she can't know it came from me. Alpha. She thinks I want to own her," Jacob continued, and now his hands were shaking. "But all I want is to keep her safe. To give her the life she deserves." He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I've built an empire on control, Marcus. I've bent entire industries to my will, but I can't make her trust me. And without that, all this power is worthless." Marcus had served the Alpha for 8 years. He'd seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, had watched him destroy competitors with surgical precision. He'd never seen him break.
Until now.
The interview had gone well. Too well, Diane thought with bitter suspicion as she pushed Emma's stroller down the cracked sidewalk toward Miranda's apartment. The hiring manager had been almost eager, the salary offer higher than advertised, and when Diane had asked about start dates, the woman had smiled and said, "We're very motivated to bring you on board." Motivated by what, Diane wondered? By her qualifications, or by a phone call from someone with enough power to make motivation irrelevant? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure leaning against the rusted gate of her cousin's building until he spoke. "Well, look who finally decided to show her face." Diane's heart stopped. She knew that voice, had heard it promise forever before it taught her what abandonment felt like. Brett looked worse than she remembered, his eyes bloodshot and mean, his expensive jacket doing nothing to hide the desperation radiating off him in waves. "Brett." Her hand tightened on the stroller handle. "What are you doing here?" "Heard you were in town." He pushed off the gate, moving too close, and Diane caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Heard you were doing interviews. Trying to make something of yourself." His smile was cruel. "We both know how that'll end. You need to leave." Diane tried to step around him, but Brett grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "I need to leave." His voice rose, attracting attention from neighbors who glanced out then quickly looked away. "You took my kid across state lines without telling me. That's kidnapping, Diane. I could call the cops right now." "You signed away your rights." Diane's voice cracked. "You wanted nothing to do with her. Maybe I changed my mind." Brett's eyes dropped to the stroller where Emma stirred, sensing the tension. "Maybe I realized she's worth something after all. Child support payments. Tax breaks. Maybe I've got lawyers who'd be real interested in how you're raising my daughter in poverty while you're too proud to. Let her go." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, dropping the temperature 10 degrees in an instant. Brett's head snapped up, his grip on Diane's arm loosening as Jacob materialized from the shadows at the end of the block. He didn't run, didn't rush. Jacob walked toward them with the inevitability of a storm front, his long hair loose around his shoulders, his eyes blazing with that crimson fire that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with absolute, terrifying certainty. Brett tried to hold his ground. "Who the hell are you?" Jacob didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and held it up so Brett could see the screen. Diane couldn't make out the details, but she watched Brett's face drain of color as he read whatever was displayed there. "That's your arrest record," Jacob said quietly. 3 DUIs. 2 assault charges that were dropped because the victims were paid off. A warrant in California for failure to appear. He lowered the phone, and his voice dropped to something that resonated in Diane's chest.
Let
her go. Brett's hand released Diane's arm like she'd burned him. "You can't, this is..." "Call your lawyers," Jacob continued, still not raising his voice. "Tell them you're planning to sue for custody. See how long it takes them to drop you as a client once they learn I'm involved." He took another step forward, and Brett took 2 back. "Or better yet, call the police. Tell them the Alpha is threatening you. Watch how fast they arrive to arrest you for the outstanding warrant instead." Brett looked between Diane and Jacob, his bravado crumbling into something pathetic and desperate. "You think you're so powerful." "I don't think," Jacob said. "I know. And you have 30 seconds to disappear before I stop being merciful." Brett ran. Actually turned and ran, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape the promise of destruction in Jacob's voice. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane stood frozen, her arms still burning where Brett had grabbed her, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Jacob had appeared like something out of a dark fairy tale, had wielded his power like a weapon, and had asked for nothing in return. He'd protected her. Not to own her, not to make her dependent, simply because she needed protection, and he had the power to provide it. Jacob turned to face her, and Diane saw the question in his crimson-touched eyes. "Will you run again?" Her answer surprised them both. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob didn't move closer, though Diane could see the effort it cost him to maintain the distance. "May I walk you inside?" She nodded, and they moved in silence through the gate, up the stairs to Miranda's 3rd-floor apartment. Emma had fallen back asleep, oblivious to the danger that had just passed, and Diane was grateful for it. Her hands shook as she tried to unlock the door, the key scraping against the metal until Jacob's hand steadied hers, not taking over, just supporting. Miranda's apartment was empty, the night shift keeping her away until morning. Diane settled Emma in the borrowed crib, then turned to find Jacob standing by the window, silhouetted against the Denver skyline that belonged to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Why did you come?" she asked. "How did you even know I was in danger?" "I didn't." Jacob's voice was raw, stripped of the commanding certainty she'd heard him use on Brett. "I've had someone watching the building, but only to ensure you were safe. When Marcus reported that your ex had been asking questions at the bar down the street, he stopped, his jaw tightening. I couldn't stay away." Diane moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his admission. "You've been watching me." "Yes." He turned to face her, and the crimson in his eyes seemed dimmed, almost human. "I know how that sounds. I know it makes me exactly what you accused me of being. But Diane, I have spent my entire life learning to control everything around me, and I can't control this." "Control what?" "What I feel for you." The words came out broken, desperate. "I was born into power. My family built an empire on domination and strategy, and I learned early that emotion was weakness. So I became the alpha, untouchable, unreachable alone." He took a step toward her. "Then I saw you on that plane, exhausted and terrified and still fighting to protect your daughter with everything you had. And for the first time in my life, I witnessed something I couldn't buy or command or manipulate." "What?" Diane whispered. "Pure strength," Jacob said. "Real power. Not the kind that comes from money or influence, but the kind that exists when you have nothing left except love and refuse to surrender. His voice cracked. You were breaking, Diane, and you were still the strongest person in that cabin.
Including me.
Diane felt tears burning behind her eyes. I'm not strong.
I'm barely surviving.
Survival is the ultimate strength. Jacob closed the distance between them, but stopped just before touching her, giving her the choice. Everyone in my world wants something from me. My money, my influence, my power. But you ripped up my card and chose poverty over becoming my possession. You chose dignity over comfort. And that's when I knew. Knew what? That I was in love with you. The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and absolute. Not because you need me, but because you don't. Not because I can save you, but because you save yourself every single day.
I don't want to own you, Diane.
I want to stand beside you. I want to be the weapon you wield against the world that's tried to break you. Diane's breath caught. You said you feel isolated, that your power makes you alone. It does, Jacob admitted, because power attracts predators and parasites, never partners. Until you looked at everything I am and ran, not because you wanted more, but because you refused to be less. His hand lifted slowly, giving her time to move away, before his fingers brushed her cheek. I'm not offering you charity. I'm not offering you a cage. I'm offering you an alliance. My resources, my protection, my heart, all of it at your command, not your burden. Jacob. Let me love you, he continued, and now his forehead touched hers, his crimson eyes burning into her soul. Let me give Emma the father she deserves. Not because you need saving, but because I need you to save me from a life where power is everything and love is nothing. Be my partner.
Be my equal.
Let me prove that my strength exists to shield yours, not diminish it. Diane's tears fell freely now, and she realized what she was crying for, not fear or shame, but hope. Fragile, terrifying hope. I'm scared, she whispered against his lips. So am I, Jacob breathed back. But I'm more scared of a world where I let you walk away. Then don't, Diane said, and closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted like surrender and victory all at once. 3 months later, Diane stood in the kitchen of a house that didn't look like it belonged to the Alpha. No sprawling mansion, no marble columns or chandeliers that cost more than cars. Just a quiet craftsman in a tree-lined neighborhood where Emma could grow up hearing birds instead of traffic, where neighbors waved instead of bowed. Jacob had offered her the penthouse, the estate, the visible symbols of his empire. She'd chosen this instead, a home, not a palace. And he'd understood immediately, had signed the deed in her name alone before she could even ask, proving once again that his power existed to serve her choices, not override them. You're thinking too loud. Jacob's voice rumbled from behind her, and then his arms were around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched Emma toddle across the living room, chasing dust motes in the afternoon sunlight. I'm thinking about how terrifying you are, Diane admitted, leaning back into his warmth. How you could destroy lives with a phone call. How people fear you. How your power is this massive, overwhelming force that could crush everything in its path. She felt Jacob tense, and she turned in his arms to face him, her hands framing his face. The crimson in his eyes flickered with old pain, old fear of rejection. But then I remember, she continued softly, that the most powerful man I've ever known uses that terrifying power to make sure Emma's pediatrician is the best in the state. That he's terrifying enough to make my landlord return my security deposit with interest and an apology. That his overwhelming force is currently building a daycare at my office, so I never have to choose between my daughter and my career. Diane, your power terrifies me, she said, rising on her toes to brush her lips against his. But your love is an absolute shield. And I'm learning that maybe they're the same thing. Maybe you're terrifying because of how completely you love us. Jacob's arms tightened around her, and when he kissed her, it was with the desperate gratitude of a man who'd been alone in his strength until someone finally saw it as protection instead of threat. I love you, he murmured against her mouth. Both of you. More than empires. More than power. I know, Diane whispered back. That's why I'm not afraid anymore. Emma chose that moment to crash into their legs, demanding attention with the imperious tone of a toddler who knew she was the center of her parents' universe. Jacob scooped her up without breaking away from Diane, and suddenly they were all tangled together. A unit that made no sense on paper, the struggling single mother, the alpha, and the baby who'd brought them together on a desperate flight. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting them in gold, and Diane caught their reflection in the glass. Jacob's crimson eyes, usually so intense and overwhelming, had softened into something almost human as he looked at her, reflecting only her peaceful face and Emma's joy.
No dominance. No calculation.
Just love, absolute and unshakable. What are you thinking now? Jacob asked, following her gaze to their reflection. Diane smiled, something she was still getting used to, smiling without fear lurking beneath it. I'm thinking that I spent so long running from power that I forgot some power exists to protect, not possess. And now I'm thinking that the most unconventional family is sometimes the strongest one. She kissed him again, tasting forever in the space between heartbeats. I'm thinking that we're going to be extraordinary. Jacob's arms tightened around them both, his empire and his influence, and all the terrifying weight of being the alpha fading into insignificance compared to this, his partner, his daughter, his home. We already are, he said, and in the quiet sanctuary they'd built together, surrounded by love instead of marble and gold, Diane finally believed him. Outside, the world continued spinning. Inside, the alpha had found something more powerful than dominion. He'd found family, and he would defend it with everything he was. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your support means everything.